Earlier this month, the world's most authoritative voice on climate change released its final assessment report of this cycle, describing how the world can reduce and prevent greenhouse gas emissions in order to slow down global warming. Since August last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put out three compelling reports warning the world's governments that if emissions don't drastically drop within this decade, global warming could cross 3 degrees, a temperature at which 29% of terrestrial species are at risk of extinction. Developing countries will bear the brunt of rising temperatures, and according to the report, India is likely to face more severe droughts, intense rainfall, and more frequent heat waves in the next few decades. If we don't adapt, rice, wheat, pulses, and coarse grains are likely to see an 8.62% drop in production by 2050, affecting food supplies and the economy. The IPCC has been producing these reports for decades, but for the first time, this cycle was more solution oriented and sensitive to the issue of equity when it comes to who's responsible for climate change. So, what do the IPCC reports say about how to adapt to and mitigate climate change? And what do the findings mean for a developing country like India? This video seeks to answer those questions. My name is Simrin Sirur, and you're watching Tipping Point. The last decade saw the highest carbon emissions in human history at 56 gigatons. Past emissions haven't helped make the world more climate resilient, and high income countries like North America and Europe are responsible for 39% of historical emissions released since 1850. Because of this, developing countries that have contributed a fraction to historical emissions will face the most loss and damage due to global warming. The solution, the reports say, lie in a combination of conserving natural resources, ending our reliance on fossil fuels, using carbon removal technologies and techniques, developing our economy sustainably, building climate appropriate infrastructure, and providing poorer countries with the finance they need to weather the climate change storm. I spoke to two IPCC authors about some of the tools a country like India might need to become more climate resilient. India, remember, made some very ambitious targets at the COP26 last year, promising to set up 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2070, among other goals. If you want to know more about India's climate goals, check out our older episode of Tipping Point, which breaks it down. Dr. Navroz Dubash, a professor at the Center for Policy Research, wrote about how national policies and building of institutions can put countries on the path to climate change mitigation.
The idea is that we focus a lot on policies, we focus a lot on targets when looking at mitigation, but those policies and targets need to actually be implemented. The IPCC says we are on a clock here, right? If you want to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees, there is a finite carbon budget. So if we're on a clock, you have to be able to say what is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck by when and what else do we need to do. So that is a huge knowledge task, right? So there's a knowledge come strategy task. And so a lot of countries have set up knowledge based dedicated climate institutions, which don't make decisions, but they advise decisions and they're regularly updating that information. One of the key things that they look at, so for example, they may look at, what can we reasonably do by 2030 in a given country? What can we do by 2040? One of the key things they look at, especially in developing countries, is what are the synergies and trade-offs with other development objectives? Is this going to make air pollution better or worse? Is it going to make livable cities better or worse? Is it going to create jobs or lose jobs? Right? Perhaps the third is the most important. So we don't have, in most countries there isn't, and not in India certainly, there isn't a knowledge institution saying what is that strategic vision for the country. The second is climate change decision making is often hived off to environment ministries around the world, including in India. Environment ministries aren't in a position to either know about or drive changes in power sectors, mining, agriculture, urban development, and so on and so forth. So many parts of the economy, right? So you need to have a coordination structure within government that takes into account that this is an all of government, all of society problem.
The idea is to have a knowledge center that can start conversations on how to mitigate climate change, but that are also held to account by people who are most vulnerable to it.
So our chapter talks explicitly about procedural justice. So how do you design institutions that are open and give people voice? Redistributive justice in terms of the impacts of particular policies, and recognition justice. Recognizing the the impacts that vulnerable communities have faced and the disadvantages that they have faced. Similarly, it's not just that they've slowed down the pace of change. There are legitimate justice reasons why you don't want poor communities, coal communities, and so on to bear the brunt of this transition. You have to find a way of making them part of a new technology transition, right? So to do that, that's another big governance challenge. How do you do that through a deliberative process that doesn't just take for granted their perspectives and their needs, but actually involves them in the decision making? So South Africa is a leader on this. They have a presidential commission on climate change that looks at a coal transition in South Africa. Many countries have set up just transition commissions or committees. So these are all institutional bodies aimed at that building consensus, given that you have winners and losers. So therefore, coordination, strategy, and building consensus are three kind of enormous governance challenges that are, if not unique to, but very specific to climate change. So the tagline we use for this is, we think about policies and targets, but actually a key part of this is building a climate ready state, because the state in most parts of the world is not climate ready.
Dr. Dubash's points were echoed by Dr. Anjal Prakash, Research Director and Adjunct Associate Professor at the Indian Institute of Business. Dr. Prakash's contributions focused on why urban spaces are among the most vulnerable to climate change and how they can adapt to lessen the blow. To be clear, the reports address several factors that deal with climate change, from industries to agriculture to land and water ecosystems. You can read more about it in the print's coverage of the reports. But the aspect of growing cities interested me, given 300 million more people in India are projected to live in them by 2040. This is what Dr. Prakash had to say about India's growing cities.
So in 2040, between 2040 and 50, it looks like about 40 to 45% of people will be living in urban areas. That means more and more people are going to be at risk. Now, let me just explain to you why our urban areas are more, risky places. One is because the density of population is going to be much more higher. It's already going up. So number of people who, if any climate catastrophe strikes, the number of people who will be affected will be much, much higher. I'll give you some example. For if you look at the recent cyclone that has occurred in, say, Kolkata or Chennai or Mumbai, the people who are affected directly is a couple of crores of people, right? If you look at India's geography, we are not safe from any part, because we have most of the world's ecologies. If a heat wave strikes, it is affecting us. If the cyclone comes, it is affecting us. If it is a glacial decline or glacial avalanche due to global warming, all that is going to affect. From all sides, we are actually being very, very vulnerable in terms of geography of our spaces. And urban areas actually are located within that, because these are the high concentration of people who will be directly affected and is being affected by the catastrophe that we are facing day to day.
Within cities, it's the most marginalized and poor who are vulnerable to climate change.
So urban poor lubricate growth, but they are taken care. They actually are less taken care. In fact, they have been missing in the entire sphere of planning, and that's where we are saying that put them up. How do we put them up? By talking to them, by understanding. So what we are saying that is also have to understand the bottom-up planning. You can't have climate change issue definitely a top down, because it gives you a kind of a broad understanding of how climate change is going to impact a city, but you also need to have ward level planning, so that you understand what are the risks and vulnerabilities of these people who are living in each ward, and then link it up with the larger planning that you have. Sometimes the solutions are very inherent in the system that we are also working. So what we need is the transformational policies. For example, city level planning. We talked about in the city level, we talked about green and blue infrastructure. How do we enhance green and blue infrastructure for the cities? So if, for example, the water bodies are protected in the cities, who will be impacted much more? People who are directly dependent on, bore water, whose bore will be recharged, and they will not be facing any issues, especially in terms of lack of access to water. Especially, so if the city is much cooler, 5 degree cooler, because of the tree plantation which has happened all across the city, then people who are directly impacted by the heat wave will be saved. So what we are saying is that transformational activity or any transformational change that we are looking at, that has direct impact, especially for the poor and the marginalized, because this is their life which is directly impacted.
Like Dr. Dubash, Dr. Prakash also believes that the Environment Ministry alone can't fight climate change and doesn't have the resources to implement change across sectors. His idea is to set up a ministry for climate change that can address and implement the transformational policies he's referring to. But whether it's a knowledge center or a separate ministry, what the authors indicate is the need for an authority that can create an institutional push that's needed to get the ball rolling.
What we had looked at in our chapter also, that having right policies, infrastructure and technology in place will actually enable changes in what we call the lifestyle and the behavior of people. And our calculation is what we can reduce 40 to 70% of greenhouse emission only with the right changes in all the three factors that I've talked about. So institutional factors comes the first one, that you need to have the architecture of institutions which delivers on ground. Definitely has to be followed by the technology, a right technology, and third by resources, because you cannot have if you have both, but you also need to have money to take this forward. The combination of these three will definitely reduce our carbon footprints, and especially cities, which is going 70 plus contribution is about 70 to 72% to the global space of carbon footprint. It will reduce with the better planning, and it's also with better understanding of how institutional systems work and how the changes are required, especially the transformation changes that is required in urban spaces.